Welcome to Shatter.
Help me reach 5,000 subscribers. Support the video with a like and leave your thoughts in the comments. She leaned in close so no one else could hear and whispered that there would be no intimacy until we got home. Her breath smelled like champagne and mint. I laughed and told her not to worry, that he had already taken care of that. I said it lightly, like a joke you throw away before it lands. She didn't find it funny. Her smile froze, just for a second, long enough for me to see the crack. The room was loud with music and applause, the kind of venue she loved because it made her feel chosen. I stood there in my suit, the same posture I kept at work on the factory floor, still, measured, watching for defects. That habit never leaves you. I'd spent years as a quality engineer, learning how to notice what others miss. Hairline fractures, patterns that don't add up. Tonight, the defect was standing 3 feet away from my wife, laughing too hard at something he'd already said twice. Ethan had been part of our circle for years. Birthdays, backyard grills, late nights that bled into early mornings. Safe. Familiar. The kind of guy you trust around your home because everyone else does. I watched how he angled his body toward her, how she mirrored it without thinking. They weren't touching. They didn't need to. Weeks earlier, it had started somewhere harmless enough, at an IHOP after one of her events. She told me it was just a few of them decompressing, coffee and pancakes, nothing worth mentioning. That's how these things always begin, inside the ordinary, wrapped in sugar and excuses. I didn't question it. I trusted routines. I trusted her. Back at the party, I took her hand and led her to the dance floor. Not possessive, not distant, neutral. I let the space between us exist, visible to anyone who knew how to look. I wasn't performing. I was stepping out of a role I'd played too long. Later, she asked why I was being strange. I said I was tired. That part was true. I left before she did, walked out into the cool air, and sat behind the wheel of my Chevy Silverado. I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat there, hands steady, breathing slow, understanding something with absolute clarity. I wasn't angry. I was done negotiating for access that should have been mutual. And once that door closed inside me, it closed quietly, without the need to announce itself. The next morning, the house sounded the same but felt altered, like a machine running with a loose bolt. Disney Plus murmured from the living room, some animated movie she used as background noise while getting ready. She moved through the kitchen in her usual rhythm, barefoot, phone in hand, already halfway into another day that didn't include me. I watched from the doorway and said nothing. I went to work early. On the production floor, everything made sense. Measurements, tolerances, cause and effect. People think engineering is about machines, but it's really about patterns. And once you see one, you can't unsee it. Around noon, Mark from logistics pulled me aside. We'd known each other long enough that he didn't need to dress things up. He asked how my wife was doing, mentioned he'd seen her recently at a late-night breakfast spot with Ethan after one of her events. He smiled like it was casual, like it was friendly. Then he paused, just long enough. Said nothing else. That pause was the first realidar. I nodded, thanked him, went back to my desk. Inside, something aligned. Not rage. Not jealousy. Confirmation. That night, she came home late, dressed down but still polished, wearing her Lululemon jacket like armor. She talked about work, about how exhausting people were, how she needed space to feel like herself again. I listened without interrupting. When she reached for me out of habit, I stood up and went to shower. No explanation. No tension. Just absence. The following days rearranged themselves quietly. I stopped asking about her schedule. I canceled a weekend plan without replacing it. I slept on the couch once, then didn't come home at all. When she asked where I was, I said I had an early start and left it there. I began eating breakfast alone, sitting in the truck with a coffee, watching the sun climb like it always had. Stability doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes. On Thursday, I posted a few items on Facebook Marketplace. Tools I didn't need duplicates of. A chair she liked. Nothing dramatic. Just preparation. She noticed, of course. Asked why I was selling things. I told her I was simplifying. That was the second dadar. Not to her. To the illusion that I was still participating. She started watching me instead of her phone. Started asking questions she didn't want answered. And I understood then that silence wasn't passive. It was movement in another direction. Evidence never announces itself. It accumulates. Quiet, patient, waiting for someone who knows how to look. I didn't snoop. I didn't check her phone in the dark or demand passwords. I simply stopped filling in the gaps for her. When you remove your assumptions, patterns expose themselves. She began showering longer, locking the door even when I was barely home. Notifications lit up her screen and disappeared before I entered the room. Names without context. Silence with shape. At night, Disney Plus kept playing to no one. The same episodes restarting like a loop designed to mask absence. The house stayed awake long after intimacy had gone. One evening, she left her laptop open on the counter while she took a call in the hallway. I wasn't trying to see anything, but I did. Calendar invites shifted, renamed, disguised as work prep. Locations that didn't line up with venues I knew. A pattern of Tuesdays that led nowhere I could trace with logic alone. Later, in the garage, I noticed the smell of cologne that wasn't mine lingering in the air. Subtle. Expensive. The kind you remember because you don't own it. Ethan wore something like that. I remembered him leaning in too close at gatherings, his hand always hovering, never landing. Respectful enough to be deniable. I said nothing. The next morning, instead of driving straight to work, I pulled into the Home Depot parking lot just after sunrise. I didn't need anything specific. I walked the aisle slowly, letting the normalcy settle my pulse. People assume preparation looks like panic. It doesn't. It looks like calm. When I got home that night, she was dressed for the gym, pulling on her Lululemon leggings, telling me she needed a late workout to clear her head. I nodded. No questions. No reminders. I stayed at the table after she left, scrolling through Facebook Marketplace, watching bids come in. Objects shed weight easier than people. An hour later, Mark texted again. This time he didn't name names. He didn't need to. He mentioned a friend who'd seen something awkward after midnight at a familiar diner. A laugh that lasted too long. A hand on a knee. No drama. Just confirmation. That was enough. I slept somewhere else that night. Didn't announce it. Didn't justify it. I understood then that proof wasn't about catching them. It was about deciding what you were willing to live with. And I wasn't willing anymore. Disappearing doesn't require drama. It requires consistency. I stopped returning home at night. Not abruptly. Gradually. The way a tide pulls back before anyone notices the water is gone. I left early in the mornings, before the sky fully decided what color it wanted to be. The truck started quietly, and I didn't look back at the house once I reached the street. I slept in a place that didn't know her name. A spare room offered by someone who didn't ask questions. I told work I needed flexibility, and they gave it to me without curiosity. Reliability buys you silence when you need it. She noticed by the third night. Not because she missed me, but because routines had been disrupted. The house no longer reset itself around her. Disney Plus played into empty rooms. Coffee mugs stayed unwashed. The quiet stopped feeling intentional and started feeling wrong. She called. I didn't ignore it. I just didn't answer right away. When I did, hours later, my voice was calm. I said I was busy, that I needed space. Those words sound harmless until they're enforced. I spent mornings walking through Home Depot again, the way some people walk through churches. Order, structure, things that can be fixed with the right tools. I bought nothing. I left with clarity. By the end of the week, she started adjusting her schedule, coming home earlier, leaving later, watching the driveway through the front window. She asked if everything was okay between us. I told her yes, because conflict wasn't the point. Distance was. On Friday night, I didn't show up to a gathering we were both expected at. She went alone. Ethan was there. People noticed the empty space where I should have been. They always do. Absence draws more attention than presence ever did. Late that night, she sent a message asking where I was sleeping. I replied with a location that wasn't specific enough to find. That was the moment she understood this wasn't a phase. I wasn't punishing her. I was removing myself from a role I no longer consented to play. In the quiet, I felt something unfamiliar settle in. Not loneliness. Relief. The kind that comes when you stop explaining yourself to people who benefit from your confusion. I didn't disappear. I relocated my attention. And once that shift happened, everything else followed naturally. I didn't go looking for Ethan. I didn't need to. Men like him leave trails without realizing it. They confuse charm with invisibility. He worked freelance, creative projects stitched together by reputation and proximity. Everyone knew him. No one really knew what he did. That kind of freedom depends on other people staying quiet. I didn't confront him. I adjusted the environment around him. At work, I requested a temporary shift change. Gave myself earlier evenings, later mornings. That alone altered the overlap he'd grown comfortable with. The nights she used to disappear into became less predictable. Structure has a way of exposing impulse. One afternoon, while sitting in the truck outside a Home Depot, I opened my phone and scrolled through Facebook Marketplace. Not to sell this time. To watch. He was there too. Selling equipment. Offering services. Networking disguised as decluttering. I recognized the pattern immediately. Cash flow problems always surface before character flaws do. I didn't message him. I didn't warn anyone. I simply passed along information where it already belonged. Quietly. To people who cared about reliability more than charisma. Producers talk. Venues talk. Especially when they think they're protecting themselves, not participating in someone else's story. That weekend, she came home unsettled. Less confident. Still dressed well. Still wearing the Lululemon version of calm. But something underneath it had shifted. She asked if I'd heard anything strange about Ethan. I told her I hadn't. That was true. I hadn't heard. I'd noticed. She mentioned a project of his that had fallen through. Said it was probably nothing. I nodded. The less you react, the more people fill the silence themselves. By Sunday, she was restless. The house felt smaller to her. Disney Plus played again in the background, louder than usual, like noise could compensate for instability. She moved from room to room, checking her phone more often, waiting for reassurance that didn't arrive. I stayed distant but present. Polite. Controlled. I didn't offer comfort because comfort would have suggested alliance. I wasn't allied with confusion anymore. Ethan didn't disappear. He destabilized. And that's worse for someone who survives on perception. Invitations slowed. Messages went unanswered. Nothing traceable back to me. Just a gradual loss of footing. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt alignment. When you stop protecting someone else's secret, gravity does the rest. The shift became visible before it became loud. That's how these things surface when no one is accusing anyone of anything. A small family dinner was the first place it showed. Nothing formal. Just people who'd known us long enough to recognize balance. I arrived alone, on time, calm. She came later, distracted, scanning the room the way people do when they're looking for an anchor they're not sure still exists. Ethan wasn't there. Someone asked about him anyway. The question hung in the air longer than it should have. No one pressed. They didn't need to. When silence stretches, it does the talking for you. At another gathering, someone mentioned a canceled project of his, framed as a scheduling issue. Another person added that he'd been harder to reach lately. No judgment, just observation. I watched her process it in real time. Watched her realize that the room was no longer bending to protect a narrative she'd relied on. Back home, Disney Plus ran in the background again, brighter than the mood allowed. She turned it up, then down, then off. The house had stopped cooperating with her need for distraction. She tried to draw me in with questions about my week, my plans, my absence. I answered politely, fully, without offering access. The difference matters. She started staying in more, wearing Lululemon like armor instead of costume. The late nights slowed. Not because she chose me, but because the alternative had lost its shine. Impulse collapses when witnesses stop applauding. One evening, she asked if people were talking. Not accusing, just asking. I told her people always talk. That was the truth. They just choose their moments. The next social event, she didn't go at all. Sent excuses. Claimed exhaustion. I went alone again. Someone commented on how composed I seemed. Another person remarked that distance can clarify things. No one mentioned her by name. That's when you know the shift has completed. At home later, she sat at the table and scrolled through Facebook Marketplace on her phone, not buying or selling, just moving her thumb, waiting for something to stabilize. I stood, grabbed my jacket, and said I had an early morning. I drove until the streetlights thinned, parked, and sat in the truck with the engine off. I felt no urgency to return. Social gravity had done its work. Not through exposure, through alignment. And she was beginning to understand that control doesn't disappear with a fight. It disappears when the audience stops believing the performance. Isolation doesn't arrive suddenly. It settles in once people realize they're standing alone in a room they thought was shared. She began testing the silence. Not with accusations, but with proximity. Sitting closer on the couch. Asking neutral questions that carried weight beneath them. She waited for me to lean in, to reassure her that whatever had shifted could be named and fixed. I didn't move. Distance only feels cruel to the person who relied on it being temporary. The house became quieter in a way noise couldn't solve. Disney Plus stayed off more often now. She no longer trusted distraction to work. When she spoke, she watched my face closely, searching for reactions the way she used to scan rooms at her events, reading energy, managing impressions. But I wasn't an audience anymore. She reached out to friends more frequently, not to confess, to anchor. The responses came slower, shorter. People don't withdraw out of loyalty. They withdraw when something stops making sense. One night, she mentioned feeling invisible, said it casually, like an observation about the weather. I nodded and kept scrolling on my phone, finalizing another listing on Facebook Marketplace. An old lamp, a bookshelf we'd argued about keeping. Each item felt lighter once it was gone. She asked where I'd been sleeping lately. I gave a general answer. Safe. Nearby. Not hers to claim. The question wasn't about logistics. It was about control. And control only exists when both people participate in the illusion. The next morning, I woke before sunrise and drove to Home Depot again. The parking lot was nearly empty, the sky still undecided. I walked the aisles slowly, listening to the echo of my steps, grounding myself in the predictability of concrete and steel. No one there knew me as her husband. That anonymity felt earned. When I returned later that day, she was sitting at the kitchen table, still in workout clothes, untouched coffee cooling in front of her. Lululemon stretched across her shoulders like a uniform she no longer believed in. She looked smaller, not weaker, unmoored. She asked if I still cared. I told her I cared about clarity. That answer didn't comfort her. It wasn't meant to, because by then, I understood something she hadn't yet accepted. Being present without being available changes the entire dynamic. I was still there, still calm, still solid, just no longer hers to lean on. And that realization isolated her more effectively than any accusation ever could. The confrontation didn't happen the way people imagine. There was no raised voice, no dramatic reveal, no moment where everything spilled out at once. It happened in a narrow space between sentences, where intention replaces explanation. She asked to talk late one evening, standing in the doorway like she was afraid to cross a line that had quietly appeared. I stayed seated. That detail mattered more than words. Power shifts are physical before they're verbal. She spoke carefully, as if precision could undo momentum. She said she felt the distance. Said she didn't recognize us anymore. Said she needed to understand what was happening. Her voice stayed steady, but her hands didn't. I watched them clasp and unclasp, the way people do when they're trying to stay composed without knowing which version of themselves is being evaluated. I didn't correct her. I didn't offer reassurance. I let the silence stretch until it became clear that whatever answer she was waiting for wasn't coming. She mentioned Ethan without saying his name, referred to misunderstandings, to timing, to emotional exhaustion. She framed everything in abstractions, hoping I'd step in and ground it, the way I always had. I didn't. When she paused, I told her I wasn't confused, that I didn't need more information. That clarity doesn't always require conversation. She asked if I was leaving. I said I had already left the version of this that required me to compete for honesty. That was the moment her control finally broke. Not into tears, into stillness. The kind that comes when you realize negotiation is over and the terms were never yours to set. Later that night, she went out alone. Not to an event, not to be seen, just to escape the house that no longer reflected her. I stayed in, listing the last few shared items on Facebook Marketplace, moving my life into lighter containers. I slept elsewhere again, woke before dawn, sat in the truck with the engine running, watching the sky pale. For a moment, I thought about the first late night she'd mentioned IHOP, how normal it had sounded then, how easily trust accepts familiar settings. By the time I drove off, I understood the confrontation had already ended, not because she gave up, but because I had. And once a man stops asking to be understood, the conversation loses its leverage. Her collapse wasn't dramatic. It was administrative. Quiet losses stacked one on top of another until there was nothing left to lean on. It started with small exclusions. She stopped getting invited to planning meetings that used to feel automatic. A venue she'd worked with for years went silent. An event date she'd penciled and disappeared from her calendar without explanation. People didn't accuse her of anything. They simply stopped prioritizing her. That kind of demotion cuts deeper because it offers no one to argue with. At home, the air felt heavier. Disney Plus played again, but now it sounded desperate, like noise trying to impersonate comfort. She watched shows she'd already seen, not for entertainment, but to avoid thinking. I passed through the house like a guest with a return ticket, polite, detached, uninterested in rearranging furniture that no longer belonged to me. She tried to rebuild familiarity by referencing the past. Small memories, shared jokes, routines we used to have. Each one landed flat, not because they were false, but because they were expired. Connection has a shelf life when it's used as leverage. Ethan didn't disappear entirely, but his orbit shrank. The creative momentum she'd borrowed from him evaporated. Whatever version of herself she'd felt reflected there was gone now, replaced by practical consequences. Impulse doesn't survive scrutiny. One night, she sat alone at the table long after I'd gone to bed elsewhere. The next morning, she asked if I'd heard from anyone about upcoming work. I told her no. That answer carried more weight than any accusation. It confirmed what she already knew. She began revisiting moments she'd dismissed before. The nights I stayed home while she went out. The way I listened without interrupting. The consistency she'd labeled boring because it didn't sparkle. Now those memories surfaced sharply, not as comfort, but as loss. Each one arrived too late to be useful. I watched this from a distance I'd earned. Not cold, just clear. By the time she realized I wasn't part of her recovery plan, the ground beneath her had already shifted. There was no villain to point at, no scandal to explain away, just an absence she couldn't negotiate with. Her world hadn't collapsed because she was exposed. It collapsed because the person who stabilized it stepped aside, quietly, and never stepped back in. And for the first time, she had to stand in the silence she'd created without me filling it. The end didn't arrive as a decision. It arrived as a moment of stillness that neither of us tried to interrupt. She asked to see me one last time in the house. Not to talk things through, not to argue, just to exist in the same room without pretending. I agreed because there was nothing left to protect. When I walked in, the place looked staged, like she'd tried to reset it to an earlier version of us. The lights were softer. The TV was off. Disney Plus didn't hum in the background for once. She stood near the kitchen, hands folded, posture careful. Not defensive, exposed. For the first time in a long while, there was no performance in her face. Just fatigue and recognition. She said she finally understood what she'd lost. Not Ethan. Not work. Me. The version of me that had been steady enough to make everything else feel optional. I didn't argue with her conclusion. Agreement wasn't necessary. She asked if there was any way back. Not desperately. Honestly, that mattered. I told her I hadn't disappeared. I had simply stopped showing up where I wasn't respected. I said that if anything were ever rebuilt, it wouldn't be on urgency or fear. It would be slow, conditional, on terms that didn't require me to trade my clarity for her comfort. She nodded, not because she liked the answer, but because she recognized its weight. For the first time, she wasn't asking for reassurance. She was listening. I didn't stay long. There was nothing else to say that wouldn't dilute the truth. As I walked out, the air felt lighter, not because something was resolved, but because nothing was being forced. Outside, the morning was quiet. I sat in the truck for a moment, hands on the wheel, engine off, letting the pause exist without filling it. Power doesn't announce itself. It settles when you stop explaining. I drove away without anger, without triumph, without regret. I wasn't leaving her behind. I was moving forward without negotiating my value. Whatever happens next isn't about punishment or reconciliation. It's about alignment. And for the first time in a long time, my life was aligned with me. Drop it in the comments. Hit subscribe. This is where we talk about what doesn't get forgiven.